Good afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing today?
Good.
My name is Michael Schearer. I go by the Pres 98. I want to talk to you about drone law. Well, what is drone law? Well, who knows? There's really very little developments in this area yet, but it's coming, and it's coming real soon. So I want to talk to you about a little bit about drones from the perspective, from the legal perspective. We'll talk a little bit about what drones are being used for now, what they are anticipated to be used for, and how the government's trying to get involved, and all sorts of issues that should be interesting to you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I spent 9 years in the United States Navy as a naval flight officer doing electronic communications and jamming in the EA-6B Prowler. You ever go to an air show? You probably go to an air show, you get to climb in planes. You see something that's yellow and black, like this handle on the top of my head? Don't pull that. That's an ejection handle. I'm sitting in a rocket-powered ejection seat, and in this aircraft, if I pull that handle, the canopy doesn't go away. I go through the canopy. So, I'm a fourth-year evening law student at the University of Maryland. I'll be graduating in May, and I currently work full-time as a government contractor for Booz Allen Hamilton. So that's my credentials. And next I want to tell you about why you should be skeptical of the things I say. This is a slide that I really try to include all the time when I talk. Because I think I know what I'm talking about, but maybe I don't. And maybe you, in one area or one thing that I talk about, maybe you know more than me. So call me on it, or look at the original research and come to your own conclusions. First of all, I'm not a lawyer yet. I don't graduate until May. And even then, doesn't mean I'm an expert on drone law, but I think I know a little bit about it. So I want to talk about terminology. You'll hear lots of different terms for what I'm going to refer to as drones. For the purposes of this presentation, I use drones. But really, these are terms that people have proposed or people have talked about to what to call drones. And even within the drone community, people, there's this ongoing, long-held fight about what to call drones. And the first one is drone, and a lot of people don't like it because when you think of drones, you're thinking of some terrorist in Yemen being hit by a drone strike by the CIA or something like that. And so it has a negative connotation associated to it. So when people think, I don't want to call this a drone because it has that negative connotation. All of these are things that people might call them. Crone, like commercial drone, they're just dumb. Unmanned aerial vehicle, unmanned aerial system, small unmanned aerial system, quadcopter, multicopter, remote piloted aircraft, remote piloted vehicle, remote piloted aircraft system, unmanned aircraft, model aircraft, robot, and Skynet. Well, nobody calls it Skynet, but I just added that because it's kind of cool. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to call it a drone. But if you want to call it something else, go for it. The FAA typically uses unmanned aerial system or small unmanned aerial system, but the European Union uses remote piloted aircraft. So, I mean, everybody has their own terms, and some of them encompass more things than the others. But, so there you go. I want to talk a little bit about history because the history and development of aviation law is really important to the history or to the current development of drones. And I know what you're all thinking. Somewhere in the slides, am I going to talk about if there's a drone flying over your backyard, can you shoot it down? I will answer that question for you, but not quite yet. So there's an old common law doctrine called ad coelum. There's the Latin phrase, and it translates to who's ever in the soil, it is theirs, all the way to heaven and all the way to hell. And what this meant was, if you owned land, if there was something under the land, like minerals or oil or whatever, that was your right. So if you live in Pennsylvania and the Marcellus Shale is underneath you and there's a whole lot of natural gas, someone can't come into you and just take the natural gas out of the ground. They have to sign, you own it. You own the rights to that. So you can sign a contract so that they can take the natural gas out of the ground. And up until the development of aviation, this meant the opposite was true. Everything above your property belonged to you. Well, of course, until this started happening. At the turn of the 18th century, people started flying hot air balloons, so you could fly above someone else's property. And then at the turn of the 19th or the 20th century, people started flying, and again, now you could have controlled aircraft above someone's property. So this idea that you owned everything above and below your property really started to come in conflict with aviation and the burgeoning industry. There is one famous case that dealt with this, that went to the Supreme Court. This is in right after World War II, but it was a case that came out of World War II. There was a guy named Causby. He owned a chicken farm in North Carolina. And right adjacent to his property was an Army airfield, and they were doing training flights all the time. And so they were flying low. Every time they were coming into land or take off, they were flying right over this guy's chicken farm. And you can imagine, you have a chicken farm, loud, all these airplanes taking off. His chickens did not take too lightly to these aircraft flying over. So he sued the United States government and basically said, you are violating my property by flying over it. So the Supreme Court, referring to the ad coelum doctrine, said, well, that doctrine has no place in the modern world. They're sort of acknowledging the fact that you can't just you can't prohibit people from flying over your property. But they did say that they were flying so low, 83 feet over his property, that they were essentially taking his property. So the government had to compensate him for doing this. And the theory that came out of this case was called the enveloping atmosphere. And what this means is that you have the right to the airspace above your property to the extent that you actively use it. So, for example, if you have a 2-story home and maybe you have a 20-foot antenna on your roof, that's essentially the extent of the property, the airspace that you're using. So if someone wants to fly a police helicopter at 500 feet over your property, they can probably do that without violating your property rights, or a blimp or a drone or whatever. Don't get caught up on the 83 feet. That's the number in this case, but the idea is the atmosphere or the airspace that you're able to use on an active basis. And I know what you're all thinking. Well, if I just put a huge tower up in my backyard, 500 feet tall, then nobody will be able to fly 500 feet. There's probably other problems with that too. Or, what if I make a daily drone flight to 500 feet over the extent all the corners of my property? Then I'm using, maybe. Nobody really knows the answers to these questions yet because they haven't been litigated, and we'll get to that. There you go. He said, what he said was, send up a weather balloon with a camera, surveillance of your property at 500 feet. Again, who knows whether you can do it and get away with it? I don't know. So, very brief history of aviation and the airspace over your property and airspace. I want to talk about the National Airspace System that is run by the FAA. Obviously, this is focused on the United States, but other countries will have similar authorities and similar laws and restrictions. So the airspace in the United States is broken up into various classes. And the ones that we want to concentrate on today are Class B, which is the big yellow one. Looks like an upside-down wedding cake. And when you think of Class B airspace, think busy airports. So Dulles, BWI, Reagan National, all the busy airports around the country will have some variation of this Class B airspace. And essentially what it means is right around the airport up to a certain distance and out to a certain distance, everything within that yellow birthday cake or wedding cake is controlled airspace. If you're flying in it, you got to be talking to somebody on the radio. Smaller airports might have Class C or Class D airspace, and then everything over 18,000 feet is Class A airspace, and that's where all your airlines are flying. They're usually flying at 35,000 feet. If you are in Class G airspace, which is generally up to about 500 feet above the ground, that's uncontrolled. So you can do pretty much whatever you want in that airspace. You'll see test aircraft, people that build their own aircraft flying in those altitudes. Not a lot going on other than transitions. So the important thing to remember from this slide is When you're in the area of an airport or within a certain distance from an airport, you can't just do whatever you want. So where does the authority of the FAA go? How high to how low? Well, the FAA would say their authority goes all the way to the ground. So if I want to fly this guy, which doesn't have a camera on, but this is a drone and it flies, the FAA says that they would have the authority to regulate me doing that. Maybe. So just as an example, I want to show you, this is a flying chart, and I want to show you an example of what the airspace looks like over BWI Airport, which is where I live. So you see the airport in the top left there. And then you have these concentric circles. And the numbers inside the concentric circles will show you what the airspace restrictions are. So in the innermost circle, you see 100 and then a line and then SFC right here. So that means from the surface to 10,000 feet is controlled. And then 10,000 feet or 1,500 feet to 10,000, 2,500 to 10,000, 3,500 to 10,000. So as you get further away from the airport, the lower airspace is free because there's nobody using that airspace controlled. So after 9/11, so you can see the BWI airspace is up here. But as you know, there are 3 major airports in this area: Dulles, Reagan National, and BWI. And after 9/11, the FAA established the DC area flight restricted zone. This is a temporary flight restriction for 14 years. And anything that's inside the red line is inside the flight restricted zone, and you cannot fly there without permission or talking to someone on the radio from the FAA. And that goes out, I think, 25 miles. So it's a pretty big area. So I live in south of Baltimore, and I live under this area. So theoretically, by the letter of the law, I can't fly a drone at my house because I might be a threat to the White House or something. I don't know. This is the current picture. I mean, this is what it looks like. We'll talk more about this. I want to talk now about the current state of the law. So we talked a little bit about the history. We talked about the development of aviation law and how that impacts what we're doing. We talked about what the airspace system looked like. So now let's talk about the integration of drones into the national airspace system. So in 2012, the Congress passed what's called the FAA Modernization and Reform Act. And the law actually had a section in it about drones, which they refer to as unmanned aerial systems. And they put in a place of temporary rules, which are in place now. And the temporary rules are essentially this. If you want to fly a drone for hobby purposes, you can do it. There's some guidelines, which I'll show you in a second, but you can do it. If you want to fly a drone for commercial purposes, like say you're a real estate agent and you want to use your drone to get video of the property, or let's say that you're a wedding photographer, or let's say that you get hired by a golf course to do flyovers to the holes so they don't have to hire a helicopter. All those are commercial uses, and those are prohibited without an exception from the FAA. So that's what the law says. And so the FAA had put out a circular in 1981. This is before drones, but this applied to model aircraft, and they consider drones to be very similar to model aircraft. And they said if these were the rules from 1981 until about a month ago. If you're doing it for hobby or recreational use, you stay under 400 feet. Notify a tower when you're operating within 3 miles of the airport. Important to note, notify the tower. You don't have to get permission, you just have to notify them. And then you have to follow community-based safety guidelines. And there's the AMA, and there's some organizations out there for model aircraft and drone pilots that have come up with their own guidelines about how you should fly. And this is what the FAA says you should do if you want to be a hobby drone user. So about a month ago, they revised the circular, and the only thing really that they did was they changed it from 3 miles to 5 miles, and then they stressed in the circular that even though we kind of let you do whatever you want, if you fly in a dangerous manner, the FAA can still bring an enforcement action against you. And to date, there's really only one significant case that I'll talk about where the FAA brought an enforcement action against somebody for flying a drone, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. This is the current state of the law for drones. Hobby or recreational use under 400 feet within 5 miles, safety guidelines. When the government, we talked about how the commercial use was a temporary thing that's in place, and that's temporary until the government comes out with a rule. When the government wants to make a rule, they have to do a proposed rule. And so they publish it on regulations.gov, and then people, you, me, anybody can go and make comments on the rule. And many of these new regulations now get thousands of comments. And it closed in April, but the summary of the rule was this. It only applied to commercial uses, so again, the hobby drone use was okay. The current rules, before this proposed rule, was to fly a drone for commercial uses, you had to have a private pilot's license, which seems a little odd. The proposed rule would require that you don't have to have a private pilot's license, but you would have to pass like a written test about learning about the airspace and things like that. Under 500 feet and 100 miles an hour, line of sight and only during the day. And you can see someone like Amazon.com is going to have a lot of problems with this, right? They want to use drones to deliver packages to your house. Well, they can't do that with line of sight and daytime restrictions. It's just not going to work for them. So Amazon and other companies are doing most of their drone testing outside of the United States because of the current regulatory environment. So this is the proposed rule. It'll probably come out sometime next year as a final rule. And then when it's published in the Federal Register, it will be the rule. I mentioned a few minutes ago about there's really just one case that's been litigated, and there's a guy named Raphael Perker. He was hired by the University of Virginia, I believe, to fly a drone over their campus and take pictures and videos for one of their publications or something like that. And he was flying over the campus, and at some point he either flew too low or he scared somebody. I don't know, whatever happened. So somebody complained, and the case really came down to whether a drone is an aircraft. And the reason this is important is because the FAA defines what aircraft is. And if something is not an aircraft, then the FAA doesn't have authority or jurisdiction over it. So my mouse is not an aircraft. So the FAA cannot just regulate mice because they want to. They can only regulate aircraft. So the FAA brought an enforcement action against him, and they ruled against him, and then he appealed it, and the case goes to an administrative law judge within the FAA, and they reversed the case, and then the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the next level of appeal, reversed the case again against him, and then before going to an actual Article III court, the case was settled. So they tried to make him pay a $10,000 fine. He ended up paying a $1,000 fine. The important thing to remember here is that all of this took place within the administrative law context. So this case never actually reached an Article III court. When I say Article III court, I mean a judicial branch court, federal court, or state court, or whatever. So this case is interesting, but this is certainly not the final word on whether a drone is an aircraft. But this is really the only significant case that's been brought so far. And I had my presentation done until yesterday. I read about this, and it sounds like the Department of Transportation, which is overhead of the FAA, is proposing and they'll probably come out with this on Monday, is the rumor, a national drone registry, whereas when you buy a drone, you're going to have to register it with the federal government, which seems a little much, maybe? Register your drone with the federal government? Obviously, they probably don't care about toys, but if you have like a larger drone, like a DJI Phantom, which I have, then they're going to want those registered. So keep in mind that even though the FAA has authority over automobiles, automobiles aren't registered at the national level, they're registered at the state level. All sorts of things are not registered at the state or at the federal level, yet the FAA and the Department of Transportation is going to propose this. So this would be really interesting. I think there's going to be a lot of pushback against this rule. And when it comes out if it comes out on Monday, I think you'll see a lot of pushback. I will be one of those pushing back. Yeah, there'll be some kind of registration fee, of course, and So I want to talk about some of the things you may have seen in the news recently on drones, and talk about their applicability, and then we'll just. This is a DJI Phantom, the one that crashed on the White House lawn in the spring. So most of you have heard of this case, probably. So a guy goes to a party. The guy is a government employee, by the way. Goes to a party. He's drunk, and it's not his drone. It's his buddy's drone. And he says, "Hey, man, can I fly your drone?" Of course, and it's one of those, "Hey, watch this," or "Hold my beer," Flies the drone around Washington, D.C., just about 3 or 4 blocks from here, and somehow loses control of the drone and doesn't think anything of it. Wakes up the next morning and sees that someone crashed a drone on the White House lawn. And so he owns up to it. He said, "I think that might have been me." And so yeah, that put a lot of spotlight on the drone community that probably we didn't want, because if you can imagine, this is not quite the worst thing that could happen, but it's pretty bad, because now the federal government is like, well, and everybody wants to know, well, how can we stop these things? How can we control them? How can we register them? The Secret Service now is doing testing on what happens when the next person brings a drone with explosives or whatever. Who knows? Maybe they'll use a drone to carry drugs. Yes, they've tried that. This happens like every few months now. Somebody tried to smuggle drugs across the border using a drone. And so I can just tell from looking at this, they've tried to put far too many drugs on this drone. There's like several packs on the ground. If you just did they were getting greedy. Do 1 or 2 and it'll probably work. There was a case in not a case, but it was in the news just a few weeks ago, or a month or 2 ago, and you've seen people try to smuggle things into prison with drones, cell phones, drugs, all kinds of things. Somehow they always crash. Amazon and other companies are looking at drones for commercial purposes. Like I said, they can't really test what they want to do in the United States, so they're going to Europe and other countries where the regulatory environment is not so bad, because they can't their delivery system is going to require them to fly outside of their line of sight. So whether or not the rule makes some kind of exception for this, we don't know. So this may or may not happen. If the rule comes out the way that the FAA wants it to come out, it's going to kill this potential option. I read about this case this is from Lebanon, but they're also doing this in Australia and a few other places on beaches, where this is called The Guardian, where they just put a life preserver on, and then when someone's out in the water drowning or is in trouble, they just fly the drone out and drop the life preserver before the lifeguard has a chance to even get there. So this is one of those cases where this is a pretty cool thing, right? If you got somebody who's a quarter mile out and they're struggling, it's going to take the lifeguard a while to get out there. If you can just get them something to hang on to. People have also done testing with AEDs and other medical devices and ways to using drones to get things to people real fast when they may not be available. So the point of showing these things is to show you there's a lot of cool things that people are developing uses for drones, and then there's the government regulatory side, and we have to find where we can operate within those guidelines but still be able to do cool things. This is a circular put out by the Forest Service. You may have read a few of these incidents in California where there's like a forest fire and somebody's trying to fly their drone over it, and then they have to ground the aircraft, and it's a big mess. And there are a couple of cases where this has happened, and a couple other cases were surprisingly and shockingly misinterpreted by the media. So in one particular case, there was a fire going on, and it just happened to be that the area that a lot of the locals fly their drones was somewhat close to that area. So it wasn't like they said, hey, there's a fire, let's go fly our drone over it. It was more of like the fire just happened to be in an area where people normally fly drones. So, but of course, you know how the media is, and they want to make it a story. So, but it is an issue. I mean, you have to think about this idea of interfering with firefighting efforts. These people, they're out there working hard, trying to save people's homes, and people are flying drones in that area. So it's not something you can just easily dismiss. Somebody won $1 million for this one. It was like at one of those prize things, and it's basically a drone that has this like flexible structure around it. So when it crashes into something, it just bounces off. So it's a crash-proof drone. There's drone film festivals now. This is like totally, if you think about it, it's kind of interesting because it's not really about the drone. The drone is just getting you into position to take really cool photographs. But this is one in New York City that they have. And if you look at some of the videos, they're pretty cool. I mean, they just look like, really cool documentaries. You may have also seen, I don't know if my wife watches like HGTV and all those like house hunter shows. And you may see a lot of shots in those shows where you see like sort of photography of the home from the outside, and it's pretty obvious when you fly drones and you watch those shows. You'll really notice the use of drones for photography for those types of shows. So another thing that's been in the news that I want to talk about are privacy issues, and this I think came out of Colorado, and the town was gonna issue like drone hunting permits to their citizens. I have no words for this guy, but so how many of you own a GoPro or a similar type of camera? Fair amount of you? A few of you? So a GoPro camera, which is sort of the most common type of camera that you'll see on a drone, it's a wide-angle lens, right? So the idea is to get as much sky, as much view as possible, at the expense of, there's no zoom, obviously. So I'll show you some videos, but the privacy issues here I think are probably overblown a little bit. The reason being is a GoPro camera is about the worst possible thing you would want if you wanted to spy on somebody with a drone. It's not like it has a telephoto lens. There are other things that for people who fly drones, you're going to have, eventually you're going to have some kind of interaction with law enforcement or government officials. Most of mine have been relatively positive. This is an interesting photo because it was taken by one of my friends, and the police, they saw him flying the drone, and they kind of, he was standing right on the sidewalk, and they just stuck their head out the window, and they challenged him to land it on the car, and he declined, which was a smart idea. But for the most part, the people that I have talked to, having done an informal survey, most people's interactions with law enforcement and government officials have been generally positive. Most people, if they're reasonable, they think it's kind of cool, and as long as you're not doing anything dangerous, for the most part, they're going to let you do what you want to do, unless it's like in New York City and then you're a terrorist. But I will talk about that. I have a slide for it. So we talked about the government sort of backdrop and the government regulatory environment. We talked about all these, this is just scratching the surface of uses of drones. But I want to talk about what are the issues that come when we try to put these two pieces together? So first of all, what I would call patchwork lawmaking, right? So we have federal law, right? So Congress passed this bill. The FAA is putting out rules. So there's federal laws we have to be aware about. States are passing laws about drones. And some states have passed laws that, for example, you can't use drones to aid in hunting or something like that. Maryland, where I live, just passed a law that says only the state can pass drone laws. The local governments can't pass their own drone laws. Then you have city, county, regional government authorities. I was flying in a state park, or in a county park, and they have some rule against flying model aircraft in the park. So they told me to stop. So, but you would not know that unless you knew exactly everywhere you're going. So you have this patchwork of laws. If you wanted to go right outside the hotel here and fly, like how do you know if you could fly or not? Who knows? Well, we're in DC, so you really can't. But there was a case up in Connecticut earlier this year. There was a traffic accident, and there was a guy who lived right nearby, and he happened to be a news photographer for, he was a stringer for a news station. So he flew his drone up over the site of the accident, and they asked him to stop flying, and eventually they ended up arresting him. And he ended up losing his job because of it. So he sued the police officer for arresting him because he said it was his First Amendment right to fly the drone. This case came down, so I don't want to get into the whole thing, but there's an issue with immunity. So police officers essentially have qualified immunity when they're doing their job. So he didn't win the case. It doesn't mean that there's not a First Amendment right to fly drones, but it's one of those cases that's out there. We talked about, we talked about regulations, statutory laws. Now we're getting into constitutional issues, right? First Amendment. We've got the Fourth Amendment issues with, can I fly a drone into my neighbor's backyard to peer into their window, or to, whatever. And so you see that there's a lot of stuff going on here. And what would be a drone presentation without some video? So the reason I chose these videos is because they fit the theme of what I'm trying to show. So this is a really quick one. I won't show the whole thing, but this is just example of something you can do. This is the Westfield Annapolis Mall, and I planned a route on Google Maps, essentially. Plotted waypoints and said, fly here, do this at this altitude, turn here, etc. Completely automated, upload the route to the drone. This is flying at about 200 feet. So I want you, just to give you the idea of what a GoPro camera looks like from 200 feet, so what you can see and what you can't see. And I pray that this works. And it won't. No. Always have a backup. So I'm just going to show real quick a little bit of this. So I'm in the parking garage, on the top of the parking garage, and the drone just took off, and it's just going to fly around the outside of the mall, around the parking lot. It's flying at about 10 miles an hour, and it's going. Oh, hey, that would be helpful. So this is flying at about 200 feet with a GoPro. So you can, and then the camera's angled at about 45 degrees down. So just to give you a sense of what 200 feet would look like from a drone. I mean, you're not really going to be spying on anybody from here. I mean, it's just sort of the nature of what you're doing. But it's pretty cool. This was the first time that I had programmed a route and hoping and praying that it came back. Because it's not cheap, you know? Okay, but that's just to give you an idea. Okay. So the battery life, 20 minutes. That route was about, it ended up being about 12 minutes or something like that. Okay. There's another one I want to show you here. And this is sort of an example of why, as a drone pilot, you might want to have a little bit of knowledge of what you're doing. So this is a guy flying his drone, and obviously, and he's starting to come down. He's descending, so he's pulling the throttle back, and things don't go well. He calls it the wobble of death, and that's not really a scientific term, but I'll explain it. His drone is starting to do this. And he's falling out of the sky, so he puts full power onto it. And the camera is actually pretty stable. The drone's actually moving around quite a bit. You can see the propeller. Anyway, it didn't end well. He ended up crashing. The reason I show you this is because just do this. Much easier. So there's a thing called Vortex ring state. We have any helicopter pilots? No? So there's a thing called Vortex ring state, and the idea is that when you're flying, when you start descending in a helicopter or a drone, the prop wash from your propellers gets recirculated into above your propellers where you're trying, or your blades where you're getting lift. So you get this circulation of dirty air, and you essentially have no lift. And when you add full power like he did, you're feeding the problem, right? So this actually happened on the Bin Laden raid in Afghanistan. One of the helicopters crashed. It's because of this. This is what happened. They were trying to land in a courtyard, so the prop wash was coming down, hitting the walls of the courtyard, and then coming back up, and that's what happened. So going up is almost always a safe way to get out of a drone incident, but this guy did the one time when you can't add full power. What you have to do is move laterally out of the air that you're in and get into some clean air. This is a guy flying over a fire, an active fire with his drone. I think this will work out. So just, you know.
So the earlier question about whether or not retaliation.
Yep.
Is it, are you going to get arrested for?
This man was. This is the case. This was out of Kentucky a few months ago. Guy was flying. There was a drone flying over his property, and he shot it down with a shotgun, and he was arrested. So, just to give you a sense of, they actually. I won't show it because I'm running a little bit short on time. There's actually video from the drone that got shot down. He was flying at 200 feet. So, as high as I was flying over the mall, that's how high the guy with the drone was flying over this guy's property. He claimed it was like 20 feet above his house. It was not. So he shot it down. And he got arrested. So what this really comes down to probably is not going to have anything to do with the drone. This is going to come down to shooting a firearm into the air is essentially reckless endangerment. And you're going to get that regardless of whether you're shooting at a drone or a blimp or something else. So, yeah, you have a question? So he's asking about the hose, the firefighters. You know, there's no case there right now with the firefighters shooting the water. Whether you can do something like that you can try, and if you want to go to court and try to prove it. But it's, again, like I said, these areas haven't been litigated in the courts, so whether or not you can do it, who knows? Like that? Again, who knows? So here's what I would say. I'm not a lawyer. Here's what I would say from my perspective. If this device is sort of violating FCC regulations for what it's doing, maybe you... Right, so... Right, so you guys are coming down to the critical issues here. It really doesn't matter about the drone. It matters about how you're doing it. So if this is operating within the ham band and you're using your call sign and the drone just happens to be where you're, maybe you can get away with it, but I don't know. I think that even this is probably getting a little... we also have the anti-drone drone. So I want to close with a few slides, just like I talked about how do you know what to do. The FAA just came out with an app called Before You Fly, and because it's the government, they only let 1,000 people into the beta. So unless you are one of those 1,000 people, you can't use it. But basically what it does is when you turn it on, it'll locate you on the map, and then it'll alert you to airports, heliports, aviation area, things that are around where you're at, so whether or not you can fly or not. Just federal. So, you have a question too? It's the first 1,000 people who signed up for the beta got it. And it's already closed. So, there is a website called airmap.io, and you can click on whether or not you want to do commercial use, and then it will have generally federal airspace regulations, but it will show you what's around you. It's a different version of the FAA website. There's a website called noflyzone.org where you can register your house, and then supposedly people won't fly over it. It's probably a waste of time. The idea of this site is that you register with this site, and then drone manufacturers would use the database to program like geo-fence areas where you can't fly. So for example, after the White House incident, DJI pushed firmware to their drones if you try to take off by the White House, it won't take off. So don't update the firmware. I have a Facebook page called The Law of Drones. Just post interesting stories about drones, commercial use, hobby use, laws, regulations, a lot of the stuff that I've talked about here. So if you're interested, you can look at that. And I will open it up for questions, but before I do that, this will just totally distract you from asking questions, but I'm going to play it anyway because it will be, you will enjoy it. I think. Oh, no. So I've got about 7 minutes and questions.
Is there any case law or anything regarding trespassing if the drone actually lands on your property or if it's forced to land by some unknown entity on your property?
Not really. So what you're likely to see in the cases of drones falling on property or maybe causing damage is probably going to be the same kind of case that you would have like a car accident, right? If your drone falls into someone's house and causes damage, it's sort of just a simple insurance tort thing. I told you this would distract you from asking questions. Yes? Right.
Second thing, aren't they using the PI? One of the laws against PIs is you can't use a drone to look like a neighborhood, you know, to
Right.
watch for surveillance. And they're actually saying it's line of sight from the ground.
Right.
What they're actually using.
Everywhere is different. This is part of the problem. This is part of the problem of what I talked about, this patchwork lawmaking. It's depending upon where you live, there's different laws that apply. And most people are going to open these drones that they get for Christmas, and they're not going to have any idea what they should do or can't do or can do. So states will try, if they don't like drones, they're going to try to apply laws that they have to prevent you from doing things. Right. Sure. I mean, right, right. So the question was, what can you do if someone's someone's essentially invading your privacy with the drone? We have laws for invasion of privacy. There are tort things you can do that really don't involve the drone. It involves the invasiveness of what they're doing. So pretty much everything that you could do with the drone. Pretty much everything you could do with a drone, there's already laws out there to protect people against that. Yes, you can't maybe shoot it down right then, but you can call the police and explain what happened, and maybe you have some kind of a case against them. That's true. It's true. That's true. But you know what? That's going to happen with any piece of technology. I mean, you get every hacker tool in the world has a bad use, right? I mean, so the question is where to draw the line. And what's going to happen is in the next year, upcoming years, it's going to be the government's going to push the line this way, and consumers and advocates are going to push the line the other way, and where we meet in the middle. And nobody knows right now. Any other questions? Yeah. Right. So his question was, how do you reconcile the DC no-fly zone with your ability to fly in the area that you control in your yard or over your property? Nobody knows, because if I gave you an answer, it would be wrong because there is no answer. It's going to take someone flying over their yard and then getting arrested or getting an enforcement action for violating that, and then taking it to court. Because there just haven't been enough cases for anybody to know what's going on. ooh, that's not going to end well.
Mike, one comment about using the amateur radio and stuff. These drones, the control frequencies are outside the amateur radio band for the most part. So
They're usually in like 2.4 gigahertz or, yeah. So, I mean,
so there are some 2.4 gigahertz frequencies in the amateur band, but if you put a kilowatt on those frequencies, you're violating the law.
right. I mean, all of these things that you guys are thinking about as hackers, it's the same stuff, you know, everyone's thinking, that we're thinking about. And it's a matter of, can you do it? And who knows if you can do it? You know, I don't know. Right. And I can't tell you to go, you can try it if you want. I'm not telling you to, because maybe the FAA will make you the guy they come after. What's so interesting about this field, and I'll just close with this, is that this is sort of, how could I not end on that one? By the way, that was his, to just give you an idea of why that happened, that was his first flight with the DJI Phantom, so you're talking, I don't know, $1,200. And he lost, if you lose communication from your controller to the drone, it will automatically go back to the GPS coordinates where you took off. And apparently he took off very close to that canal. And so he did save it. Yeah. What I wanted to close with was, this is a really, even if you don't care about the law part, this is a really exciting time for drones because it's a nascent industry in terms of the government and how the government's going to deal with it. And like I said, there's so much is going to be done in the next few years. It should be really interesting to watch. Thank you for your questions and thank you for coming today.